The wind sliced through the endless expanse of the Siberian taiga, biting at Alexei's exposed face as he trudged through the snow, his breath ragged and uneven. Each step was a struggle, the snow swallowing his boots to the ankles. The forest around him felt like an ancient, watching entity, the towering pines casting long, dark shadows in the fading light of the late afternoon. The sky above was a dull gray, promising another heavy snowfall. Everything in this frozen wilderness felt indifferent, but there was something else, something darker, that had been following him for days. Alexei had come to the taiga seeking solitude. After the whirlwind of life in Moscow, the constant pressure of his failing career, and the suffocating routine of city life, he decided to escape into the wild, hoping that the isolation would clear his mind. He rented a remote cabin far from civilization, far from people, thinking the silence would help him regain his focus. He wasn't a stranger to nature. Growing up in rural Siberia had made him comfortable with the harsh winters and the vast, desolate forests. But this time, something was different. The wilderness, once familiar and almost comforting, now felt menacing. It began subtly, a feeling of unease that grew day by day. At first, Alexei thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He had been in the cabin for several days with no human contact, and the isolation could make anyone paranoid. But soon, the unease turned into something far more terrifying. On the second day, he noticed strange tracks around his cabin. They were large, far too large to belong to any animal he knew of. Bears, wolves, even the occasional elk roamed these forests, but these prints were different. They were clawed, long and deep, as though something heavy and powerful had passed through the area. What was worse was that the tracks seemed to circle his cabin, as if the creature had been watching him, studying him. He tried to brush it off as a trick of the mind, telling himself that it could have been some large animal passing through in the night. But the tracks were fresh, and they reappeared every morning, closer and closer to his door. On the third night, the real nightmare began. It was deep into the night when Alexei woke with a start. At first, he wasn't sure what had pulled him from sleep, but then he heard it, something heavy moving outside the cabin. His heart raced as he lay frozen in bed, straining to hear. The sound of branches snapping underfoot reached his ears, followed by a low, guttural growl. Alexei's breath caught in his throat. It was unmistakable now. Something was out there, something massive. Slowly, he slid out of bed, creeping toward the window. He wiped away the frost that had collected on the glass, peering out into the inky blackness. The moonlight barely illuminated the forest, casting long shadows across the snow. For a moment, he saw nothing. But then, movement, something large and hulking shifted between the trees. It was too fast to make out clearly, but he saw enough. A massive, fur-covered shape, moving with unnatural speed, and glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness, locking onto him. Alexei stumbled back from the window, his heart hammering in his chest. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to think. He grabbed the rifle he had brought for protection, more for peace of mind than any real belief that he would need it, and loaded it with shaking hands. Whatever was out, there was no ordinary animal. The growling continued outside, low and menacing, moving around the cabin. Alexei sat by the door, rifle in hand, listening, waiting for the creature to make its move. Hours passed, but the beast never attempted to enter. It just watched. As the night wore on, exhaustion overcame him, and he drifted in and out of a restless sleep, clutching the rifle as though it were his lifeline. When dawn broke, the sounds had stopped. Alexei cautiously stepped outside, rifle still in hand, scanning the tree line. The tracks were back, deep, clawed imprints in the snow, circling the cabin just as they had before, but this time they were more numerous. Whatever it was getting bolder. That was the moment Alexei knew he had to leave. Whatever was stalking him wasn't going to stop. It was waiting for something, and he had no intention of being around when it decided to strike. He packed hastily, throwing his essentials into his backpack. His plan was simple: head south back toward the nearest town and find help. It was a long trek, but he didn't care. Staying meant death. By midday, Alexei had left the cabin far behind, moving through the dense forest with as much speed as he could muster. The air was cold, biting at his exposed skin, but the adrenaline coursing through him kept him moving. Every few minutes, he glanced over his shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The tracks continued to follow him. They appeared every few hundred meters, fresh and deep, reminding him that the creature was still there, just out of sight. Occasionally, he heard it, the faint sound of branches breaking, the heavy thud of something massive moving between the trees. It never showed itself fully, but Alexei knew it was there. It was toying with him, pushing him to the brink of madness. As the day wore on, fatigue began to set in. His legs ached from trudging through the deep snow, and his breaths came in short, sharp gasps. The sky overhead had darkened, and soon the light would be gone completely. He needed to find shelter, but the idea of stopping, even for a moment, filled him with dread. He knew the creature was waiting for that, a moment of weakness. Just as the last light of day began to fade, Alexei's phone rang out in the cold silence. He pulled it from his pocket, his hands numb and shaking. It was a miracle he even had signal this deep in the wilderness. The phone's screen flickered to life, and he quickly dialed the emergency services, his fingers clumsy with fear and cold. The call connected. "Emergency services. What's your situation?" the operator's calm voice asked, but Alexei could barely hold it together. I'm being chased by something in the taiga." His voice was hoarse, panic rising with every word. He could hear the creature's low growl in the distance, closing in. "Sir, please stay calm. Where are you located?" "I'm somewhere north of UST Cut. Please, send a helicopter. There's something here. Something hunting me." The operator's voice tightened with concern. "We're dispatching a helicopter, but it may take some time. Can you find shelter? There's nowhere to hide." Alexei cried, glancing over his shoulder as the growling grew louder. The creature was close, too close. "It's coming for me," the operator spoke quickly. "We're tracking your phone signal. Stay on the line and keep moving toward open ground." Alexei's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled forward, his eyes scanning the darkening forest for any sign of escape. Suddenly, the underbrush behind him exploded with noise. Branches snapped, and a deafening roar filled the air. The creature was upon him. He ran harder than he ever had in his life, his legs burning with exertion, his lungs screaming for air. The snow felt like quicksand beneath his feet, each step a battle. The sound of the beast's footsteps pounded behind him, closing the distance. He could hear its breath now, harsh and ragged, mingled with the sickening sound of claws ripping through the frozen earth. The clearing appeared ahead of him, illuminated by the faint light of the moon. Hope surged through him. This was it. He had to make it. Then, through the darkened sky, he saw it, a helicopter. Its searchlight cut through the night, sweeping across the clearing. Alexei waved his arms frantically, screaming at the top of his lungs. The spotlight found him, and the helicopter began its descent. The beast roared behind him, enraged that its prey was slipping away. Alexei could feel its presence, the sheer power of it as it crashed through the trees, desperate to reach him. A rope ladder dropped from the helicopter, swaying in the wind. Alexei lunged for it, grabbing hold with trembling hands. His legs kicked against the air as the helicopter rose, lifting him out of reach of the monster below. Just as his feet left the ground, the creature leapt, its massive claws swiping through the air, missing him by inches. From the safety of the helicopter, Alexei looked down. The beast stood in the clearing, illuminated by the searchlight. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Taller than any man, its body covered in thick, matted fur, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It let out one final, ear-piercing roar before retreating back into the shadows of the taiga, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Alexei collapsed inside the helicopter, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The pilot turned to him, concern etched on his face. "You're lucky we got here when we did," he said. Alexei nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "It's still out there." The pilot didn't respond, but Alexei could see the worry in his eyes. As the helicopter soared over the vast expanse of the taiga, Alexei stared out into the darkness below. The endless wilderness stretched on for miles, cold and unforgiving, filled with secrets that man was never meant to uncover. Somewhere down there, the creature still lurked, watching, waiting. The taiga was a place of beauty, yes, but also one of ancient terror. And now, Alexei knew just how deep that terror ran.